Okay, this is already a nightmare. Heavy truly is the head that wears the cheap plastic Primark hairband as a crown. Oh my god, Salve! Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. That's Latin for hello. My name is Mickey Joe, and I am obsessed with all things theatre. What is going on? Why am I wearing that? I am committing to a bit, and also it's December. I have seen 50 million shows in the past month, and so here I am at literally like 1 a.m. sat in my flat about to talk to you about a Sondheim musical that I went to Paris to see, dressed like some kind of a Halloween costume shop Roman. But this is it. This is what's happening. If this is your first time meeting me, then you may be confused. My name is Mickey Joe. I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional international theatre critic, which I struggle to say with a straight face while wearing this outfit, but it's actually true. I reached out to the team at Le Lido de Paris, that's the Lido to Paris in an English dialect, because I was very intrigued about their upcoming production of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, one of the less produced Stephen Sondheim musicals. It's not a musical we see all that much in the UK, and so very interesting for it to pop up in Paris. So we are going to be talking all about the Parisian production of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, but it was also my first experience of seeing the show live. I'd seen the film, I'd seen bootlegs of previous productions. What do I think of this show's material in comparison with other Stephen Sondheim musicals? What did I think of this mostly British cast? What do I think about the show's viability to be produced in future? Is this a product of its time that doesn't stand up to modern audiences and sensibilities? Or is this a hidden gem that could actually work? I will let you know, but you're going to have to stay tuned to find out. Now, if you enjoy this one, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews about all of your favourite shows coming very soon in the West End, on Broadway, and in other locations around the world. Because when theatres are kind enough to invite me, then I am willing to get on a plane, go see the show, come back home, and put on a ridiculous outfit, apparently. Honestly, why have I done this? Who was I doing this for? If you are enjoying my nonsense, you can also go and find me on other social media platforms. I am on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, X, LinkedIn for business inquiries, all at Mickey Joe Theatre. But for fear of fiddling while Rome burns, let's get on with this one. Let's talk about A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum at Le Lido de Paris. So this show first premiered on Broadway in 1962, where its original production won a handful of Tony Awards, including Best Musical. It features a book by Bert Sheavlove and Larry Gelbart, but is perhaps best remembered in musical theatre history because it features a score, music, and lyrics by a young Stephen Sondheim. And it is based on the comedy plays of the ancient Roman playwright Plautus. It combines a few of his different farces together, a little like Into the Woods combines together different fairy tales. And the result is this fast-paced comedic romp full of mistaken identity and a little bit of slapstick and ridiculous characters in bizarre situations and disguises and ploys and ever-increasingly complicated romantic entanglements. The show is introduced by its protagonist, a character named Pseudolus, who is a slave longing for his freedom. He is owned by a family living in one of 3 houses over which our plot takes place. Theirs is a traditional and respectable family home. We have a mother and a father whose passion has maybe left their marriage a little bit. They have a son named Hero who has fallen madly in love with one of the girls who lives next door being a brothel, the house of Marcus Licus, locally noted for its unsavory reputation. The house on the other side belongs to an old man who is desperate to reconnect with his two children who were abducted by pirates at an early age. It's very Shakespearean. In fact, it's very Greek before it was Shakespearean, and now Sondheimian, because that is literally how art works. Pseudolus works alongside another slave called Hysterium while trying to perpetrate a scheme to acquaint young hero with the young lady whose name is Philia. That's the one who he's fallen in love with simply by seeing her hanging out of a window. Again, deeply Shakespearean and apparently Greek. Wait, have I said Greek twice when I actually mean Roman? Once again, I will remind you I am Mickey Joe Theatre. I am not Mickey Joe Ancient Mediterranean Empires. What happened to my GCSE Latin knowledge? Where has it gone? Ehew. Anyway, I started a sentence I didn't finish. While he is perpetrating this scheme, Pseudolus becomes acquainted with the many Roman prostitutes of the house next door, and we later meet Miles Gloriosus, a captain in the Roman army who is betrothed to the young lady Philia, inasmuch as he has purchased her hand in marriage from Marcus Licus. Lots of names in this show, lots going on. But everything ramps up in the way that you would expect from this kind of a farce. Pseudolus keeps finding himself in more and more hot water that actually becomes life-threatening. We have a lot of characters nearly falling into accidental sexual dalliances. Now, in terms of the material of this show, it seems on the face of it to be a little less intellectual than some other Sondheim shows. Certainly it feels like the most commercial thing that he had created, and he was very early in his career at this point as well. You know, he's still playing around with content and form and exploring other ideas. You can hear a lot of Sondheim intricacies within the score. You can hear that wit and that cleverness within the lyrics, which is a little bit to the show's detriment, I think, or it's something that you have to balance very carefully when you are directing it, at the very least, because with a farce like this, it benefits from laying a foundation for a lot of laughs that will then become a sort of cumulative throughout the show and throughout the narrative, and the laughs will just get bigger and bigger and bigger so that we can end up with these riotous sequences and a lot of visual comedy and chases and costuming, and just end with this cacophony of laughter. And Sondheim can be very funny, exceptionally funny, but it's never raucous belly laughs so much as wit. This is the difference. It's the difference between something being riotously hilarious and wittily charming. And far be it from me to criticise this man who I do think was an absolute genius in the world of musical theatre. But for one reason or another, this particular production of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum was not met with an enormity of laughter. Let me tell you a little bit more about this production of the show. So I am going to tell you what this looked like and how the performances were, and some really exciting staging things that happened, some areas I thought were really great, some other areas for improvement, but I want to start first of all by talking about the audience. Because this is not the first time I've seen a musical in Paris, and what has become apparent is the difference in sensibility between a Parisian audience, a British audience, and a New York audiences. You know, even between the West End and Broadway, there are differences. Let me tell you, these are very different audiences who will respond to shows in very different ways. And a Parisian audience feels as though they have less of a theatre-going culture. And something like A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and the way that this production was directed as well, engages with the audience a lot. It addresses the audience directly, which can be immediately off-putting. That's before the fact that you have audience participation. You have them pulling people on stage, you have them addressing members of the audience and requiring for them to respond in a certain way in order to continue with the scene. But not only that, this was a production that was performed in English to a Parisian audience, many of whom I'm sure speak fantastic English, certainly better than my rudimentary French. It did also have French surtitles on about 4 different screens placed throughout the auditorium to make sure that they were visible, but the creative team were eager to try and make sure the actors were delivering their lines slowly enough that the audience felt comfortable trying to follow that on stage. They didn't want the audience to be looking at the screens, because again, this is a comedy, and I feel it's very difficult to translate comedic timing and comedic delivery through surtitles, let alone all of the visual gags. More on those later. So let me tell you a little bit more about this production. This was a pretty traditional staging of The show, you know, Sondheim gets reconceived every which way. They didn't really reinvent much with this version. They weren't reinterpreting this material. They were just trying to deliver a very classic looking and feeling A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, albeit with a little bit more of an interactive pantomime sensibility with improvisational moments, with quite a few moments of French dialogue added in. We had a joke about a French-speaking character who was making fun of the English characters who surrounded him. I say English, they're all in Rome at this point, but with the English actors around him not being able to understand what he was saying and making a joke at the expense of the English audience members, which I did speak enough French to follow that one. You also had English cast members doing the occasional improvisational moment in like a pidgin French, which I think the French audience members seemed to find charming, or they were laughing at their expense, but they were laughing either way, so that's a win. This revival was directed by Cal McChrystal, who funnily enough was part of the creative team for One Man, Two Governors, which was this National Theatre smash hit comedy play, recontextualizing a commedia dell'arte play to a more recent setting. For that production, he began as associate director to Nicholas Heitner and was later renamed physical comedy director, which is interesting because there certainly were many elements of physical comedy in this production, but I would have welcomed even more, especially because of the language barrier. I think what I ended up feeling here, because there were many moments of wit in the lyrics, in the dialogue, that weren't necessarily coming across. And I think this is one of the hardest things. I mean, certainly if I were to be seeing a production in another language, even a language which I speak well, and I can follow a decent amount of French, obvious humor and punchlines are one thing, but this kind of a drier wit, especially contained within music and within lyrics, I think is very difficult to pick up on. I think it's very hard to land that comedically with a language barrier involved. What's funny in all languages, however, is physical comedy. That's a language that everyone speaks. That wasn't meant to sound nearly as philosophical as it did, but it transcends language barriers. I think pace and energy were two factors that also could have been dialed up in this production as well. We had these chase sequences where they were moving in and out of these fantastic house sets, which I will talk about in just a moment, but it did start to feel a little bit sluggish, like you were waiting for someone to awkwardly let themselves in through a door and then come out of the other side, and then you would wait a moment while nothing would happen, and then someone else would emerge from behind another set piece, they would go away, and then nothing would happen for a moment. I just wanted far more chaos. I wanted people running throughout all parts of the auditorium. I wanted it to be faster, I wanted it to be mad, or I wanted people to be getting smacked in the face and falling down and throwing things over each other. Chaos. I just long for chaos in these kind of situations, because that's the kind of thing that will make audiences laugh hysterically during those sequences, and those sequences absolutely need laughter. Gareth Valentine was the musical director for this production, the prestigious Gareth Valentine, who has worked extensively on many, many shows. It sounded gorgeous, and it had the benefit of an extensive band split over two sides of the stage, but the percussion that we had, the brass that we had, there was a harp, there was an actual harpist in the band. It sounded absolutely stunning, and it would be a dream for every musical theatre production to have this kind of a band and this kind of a sound at their disposal. Now, Tim Hatley's set design. This is a little bit of a challenging space, and it has this very large thrust square of a playing space, which is covered almost entirely by a hydraulic section which can lower very far down. When I saw Cabaret here, they lowered this all the way down, built an entire house set, and then raised it back up to bring an entire house on. For this production, that space is left mostly empty, because if you were to try and put set pieces on it, you would be obscuring sight lines, because there's audience members sitting on three sides. It's worth saying the sight lines in this auditorium are pretty great throughout, and this is a little bit of a spoiler for something exciting that happens at the beginning of this show, because as you're beginning and taking your seats on these cabaret tables and little booths, you're starting to look at the heads of the people in front of you and thinking, I don't have a fantastic view of the stage, except when the orchestra begins, the whole front section of the audience, tiers A through E, I believe, all lower down on this hydraulic lift and drop about 5 feet. I'm bad at working these things out visually, but they all go low enough down, and suddenly everyone has a fantastic unobstructed view of the stage. magical. And because you do have these little tables and it feels very social and you can have drinks and you can have snacks, what it does is it invites you into this glamorous sort of a restaurant style of a space, and then in that one moment it steadily, elegantly transforms itself into a theatre and just it redirects your attention towards the stage. But what Tim Hatley's set does consist of, as well as a pre-show with a lovely ruched curtain with these Roman columns alongside it, which are lit from inside, which is just like, that's a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, personified completely with a ruched theatrical curtain between Roman columns. Once that disappears, we have these three amazing house set pieces. They are tall and cylindrical. They have two levels inside. They have windows. One of them, the top half, rotates independently from the bottom half. They all spin around. They all move forwards and back again. Amazing, fantastic set pieces. And it's really all you need for this production. We don't feel that we need to disappear to different locations. Everything takes place in and around these three houses. It doesn't feel visually stale at all because they're such fantastic dynamic set pieces. Carrie-Anne Henry was the choreographer for this production. I've almost definitely butchered the pronunciation of her name. Maybe it's not even pronounced like that. I'm someone who has a French spelt surname that is pronounced in an incredibly boring English way, so maybe her name is Ingroil. I don't know. It's probably Henry. Anyway, perhaps best known as the choreographer of Six, the musical, she has done the choreography for this as well, which predominantly is given to the ladies of the House of Marcus Lycus. We see some exceptional dancing from them, all very characterful, all corresponding to their individual personalities. One of the courtesans is called Vibrata, and she is all energy and ferocity. There is another called Gymnasia, who has an extraordinary flexibility. My goodness, it's as though she doesn't have ribs. And finally, I must also mention Takis, the costume designer, who has done some wonderful designs for this production. Everything is incredibly indicative of character, the costumes that the courtesans wear, the costumes that the soldiers wear. Everything is quite comically short as far as the togas go. There are some very revealing outfits that people wear in this production, but they look like Roman outfits and they look like costumey versions of Roman outfits, which is the most important thing. It feels like a gaudy theatrical take on it rather than something historically accurate, which is exactly how it should feel. It is introduced to its audience, after all, as a comedy tonight and not a documentary. Now let me tell you some more things that I really enjoyed about this revival of the show. So I thought what we got really well here throughout the cast was a tremendously strong sense of character. This does have a relationship to sort of commedia dell'arte style, where there isn't a tremendous amount of depth and people don't necessarily have secondary characteristics. If you're playing the old man, you are playing elderly. If you're playing the charmed young hero, then that's really all he has. But the solution to that apparent lack of depth is to play up those cliched mannerisms and characterizations to such a campy extent, and it really works, and that's something that has been very well elicited from each of the performers in this cast, I feel. Everyone feels quite cohesively bonkers, and I appreciated that. Now, there is a moment in the second act of this show that just took my breath away and was as remarkable as it was bizarre, because we had Pseudolus and Hysterium singing this song together, and apropos of just about nothing, the hydraulic section of the front stage lowers for the first time in the show and then rises again. We begin to hear this strange little noise in the background that sounds suspiciously like running water, because it rises with a full functional fountain on it, this enormous water feature, and members of the cast dressed in enormous floral outfits doing this brief sort of balletic Follies Loveland-esque choreography. It's this incredible, remarkable visual moment that means just about nothing, emerges from just about nowhere, and exists presumably because the theatre has the capabilities and the creativity and the enthusiasm to put something like that in the middle of an unrelated song, after which it simply lowers back down and we act as though it didn't happen. But I mean, thrillingly beautiful and remarkably unexpected. Did it make any kind of a sense to that moment in the show? No, but I welcome more madness like that. Honestly, I think it's that kind of reckless abandon with which the show would have been even more exciting. And I think that kind of a moment played very well to the audience members who have come to this glamorous, gorgeous venue, perhaps expecting a certain level of visual wonder. If you think of perhaps of something like the Moulin Rouge, the actual Moulin Rouge in Paris, not the musical, they have these remarkable, incredible, unbelievable set pieces and these strong visual moments. There were also some really great, possibly improvisational moments between the actors. There was one little skit with a donkey that played very well. There were some really warmly received moments of audience participation. You know, some people were initially a little bit reluctant, but the actors were persistent enough and that paid off. I also want to talk about some of the parts of this material that I think are just wonderful and don't get enough praise alongside some of Sondheim's other work, because this for sure is his most commercial show. It's not as sophisticated as his work went on to be, but Comedy Tonight is such a brilliant opening number and enduringly catchy for this man to have been so often criticised as not writing the most instantly memorable melodies. I challenge you to walk away from that theatre and not be humming Comedy Tonight. That was his entire criticism, his entire career, was that he didn't write hummable tunes, but here you have one of his first shows out of the gate with this incredibly hummable song. Lovely is a charming song and a brilliant example of lyrics that are witty but don't necessarily get a laugh, when she's sort of unironically talking about how she's beautiful and winsome, and isn't it a shame she can neither sew nor cook nor read or write her own name, but it's fine because she's lovely. Also, Sondheim's absolute lyrical genius was there even then, to be able to rhyme tunics and eunuchs, just mwah. Roman chef's kiss. What was a Roman chef called? It must have started with like Colina or something. Is that a Roman chef? Well, that's a catering company. Anyway, let me tell you now about a couple of ways that this production could have been improved. So like I had mentioned before, I think more visual comedy, more slapstick, more fast-paced, manic chase sequences would have gone a long way, especially with a non-English audience. I also think, and I'm perhaps being a little bit presumptive here, but the British and the French have very different sensibilities when it comes to sensuality and sexuality. And the British are a little bit more prudish than just about anywhere else, honestly. And so I think for this to be a little bit of a romp and to kind of tease at being a sex comedy at various points, which is something that the French absolutely get on board with, I think that works on paper, but the actual sensibility of this show doesn't really play into that, because it's an apologetic sex comedy where every time two characters are about to fall into a romantic entanglement, the joke comes from, oh gosh, no, wouldn't that be dreadful? Let's curtail this somehow. Let's prevent that from happening. Something interrupts that. And we never really get to that kind of a fulfilling play. Like, we never even approach foreplay. It's really not that sexy of a show. You can costume it in a way that is, and you can choreograph your courtesans to be doing all sorts of unsavory things. But for an audience expecting any of that particular flavour, it really doesn't offer any kind of gratifying payoff. And that also didn't seem like a theme that this production was particularly trying to uplift. It felt like the key focus here was really playing to the room and trying to foster this sense of the audience as a participatory community, which I think was a bold undertaking and a challenge. I do also think, however, on balance, that this production convinced me not only is A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum an absolutely viable show, for sure it is absolutely dated. For sure you can feel that this was written in the 60s, but with relatively little reworking of the script and an appreciation for it being a show that is of its time, I actually think that this is something that could be produced in a major production elsewhere quite successfully. And I think the place to do that without being very UK-centric is the UK. Let me tell you why. Now, this was an American adaptation of originally Roman stories that premiered on Broadway and has been produced in London, but was now being revived in Paris, and it just made me feel as though the UK was the place for this. The reason is, it tonally feels a little bit like a Carry On movie. It feels somewhere between that and a Monty Python. Both of those have explored Greek and Roman settings before, but that's not why I say this. It's to do with the comedic tone. But directed knowingly, I don't think there's any reason why that couldn't work. And there are moments where it begins to feel a little bit like a pantomime as well. And for those participatory moments, it feels as though UK audiences would be the most prepared for those. So on the back of this production, I actually think it would be a fantastic idea if someone were to produce a major revival of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum in the UK. Maybe Regent's Park, open air. Pay homage to the outdoor amphitheatre roots of this material. Honestly, this plan is coming together. Drew McConey, get in touch. We can make this happen. But finally, this show had a fantastic cast, and I am very eager to talk to you about their performances. So I want to start by talking about the show's MVP. Those are not Roman numerals. It means its most valued player. I am talking about Josh Sinclair. Earlier this year, I saw him in a new musical called Glory Ride, a show which had its flaws, but the shining light in it was Josh's performance as its leading man. And I think he's a fantastic leading man. He was a real discovery in that show, stepping forward into a full principal role in his career. He has so many talents at his disposal. He has this wonderful voice, and with his performance in Forum now, he's playing Hero, the young romantic. He has this amazing comedy talent that we didn't know about, this ability to take himself completely unseriously. It's very familiar of Michael Crawford's performance in the film. This sort of campy but charmed and doe-eyed young man who is juvenile but also pubescent, chasing around this girl who he's madly in love with and sort of stubbornly refusing to do absolutely anything else with his time. Josh makes a lot of hilarious choices, sounds terrific, has some brilliant physicality. It's just charmingly fun to watch on stage the entire time. And he is committed to the madness of the show. I think that's really key here. In the leading role, we have veteran British actor Rufus Hound, who has come to musical theatre a little later in his career. I saw him in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, where he played Freddie in the UK premiere of the show. He was also Mr. Toad in the musical version of The Wind in the Willows. And he's playing Pseudolus in this production, having initially been cast as Hysterium, but ended up moving into the role of Pseudolus after the previously cast actor Richard Kind, who I believe had played Pseudolus before, had to depart the production. And I do think that Rufus's natural character and charisma and capabilities with an audience do make him better suited for Pseudolus than Hysterium. I just also feel as though it lacked a little character, and there was more that he could bring to it in terms of characterization. There's a lot that you can do with this role as an individual. Zero Mostel and Nathan Lane and Whoopi Goldberg even have played this part before. After One Man, Two Guvnors, James Corden was rumoured for a big revival of this show for years. And it's one of those parts, the delivery of which seals the fate of the entire production. And I think were his characterization to have been infused with a little more energy and a little more madness, a little more longing when he's singing about his freedom, a little more reckless abandon and vocal panache. I don't need for him to be a fantastically trained singer with a beautiful vocal tone. I just need for it to have more volume and exuberance and enthusiasm and hysteria. I know he's not playing Hysterium, he's playing Pseudolus, but he was almost a little too relaxed, a little too conversational throughout. He felt like the kind of Pseudolus that you would encounter at the pub, who was telling the story of the show over a pint after you've played some snooker. The stakes just didn't feel quite high enough because of the way that he pitched his delivery. As Hysterium, meanwhile, we had the wonderful Andrew Pepper, and it's a little bit of a one-note character as it's written, but he did a lovely job of portraying this sort of anxious, highly strung, precocious slave. Another comedic highlight, Valerie Gabai, possible horrible mispronunciation, she was playing Domina, and she evidently is a classically trained soprano. She did this wonderful thing whenever she was calling out someone's name, and she's meant to be very shrill and commanding and authoritative, so whenever she was calling for her husband or for one of the slaves, she would sustain this beautifully placed operatic note to make it this very sing-songy delivery of their names. This was kind of echoed by something that John Owen Jones did as Miles Gloriosus. I wanted it to have more of a similarity because those characters come to clash in the second act, and they are both very commanding and dominating in their own way. She is the matriarch of this household, he as the captain of the Roman army, and I think that kind of a parallel between those two characters would have been very funny and would have been very easily achieved because John Owen Jones has this wonderful, soaring, exceptional voice. I enjoyed his performance. He again understood the assignment of not necessarily taking himself too seriously when he removed his helmet and had this beautiful sort of a Kardashian-esque wig. I thought that was hilarious as he becomes increasingly frustrated and hysterical and upset throughout the second act. Brilliant stuff. But again, could be dialed up even further, could have even more comedy, more madness, more chaos, more nonsense, broader, bigger, camper, zanier, crazier. I don't think with a show like A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum there is such a thing as too big. But those have been my thoughts about A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum at Le Lido de Paris in France. Let me know what you thought of this production if you got to see it in Paris. Let me know where you're commenting from. Are you a French musical theatre fan? Do you agree with my thoughts about French audiences? Do you have any insights of your own to share about the difference between musicals in Paris versus musicals in London? I would be so interested to hear what you think. And if you have ever seen A Funny Thing Happen on the Way to the Forum elsewhere in the world, maybe you saw the last major Broadway revival or a regional American production or somewhere else entirely, maybe you saw it in London, let us know about that as well. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you have enjoyed. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any of my future and upcoming videos. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!